You should be pretty familiar now with shapes and how to create them. Now we're going to go into one of the ways that we can use shapes. We're going to talk about using shapes as masks. I'm going to start a new After Effects composition. I'm going to start with a new layer, and this time I'm going to use a solid. So a solid layer is just going to cover over the entire size of our composition's canvas. You can think of it, if you're familiar with Photoshop, for example, it's essentially like a solid colored fill layer. Here is the little window where I could choose a color. I will make it red so that it will really stand out from the background. So my new solid layer, it's labeled red solid. If I hide that layer, we can see the background color of our composition is white. When I come back and turn on my red solid layer again, we see bright, bright red. So my red solid layer here is active, and I'm going to come up here to the shape tool. I'll go ahead and use my old friend, the rectangle tool. And as soon as I click into this red solid layer, you'll notice immediately the red color disappears. As I draw out that rectangle, I start to see the red showing up again. So we see our white background, and we see just one small portion of our red solid layer. So what we've actually done here is that the shape that we drew out is behaving as a mask. And in fact, if we go down here to the red solid, we can see it's listed as a mask. If I highlight this mask here and delete it, it disappears and we see the entire red solid shape again. So let's try this again. I'm going to come up here to my shape tool, rectangle tool, draw out a rectangle. It hides this part of the red solid and it shows this part of the red solid. This is my mask layer. I want you to notice this little column here that says Mode. Now in your composition panel here on After Effects, it might not look like this. If you come down here to the very bottom of this panel, there's a button here that says Toggle Switches and Modes. As I press that, suddenly this display changes. This might be what you're seeing in your After Effects display right now. So to switch that view, come down here to Toggle Switches, click that, and then you'll see these columns here that we're using now. So the first column is Mode. Here we have a little pull down menu here. Right now it says Add. If I click this down, I have other options. For our purposes in this course, the only settings here that we're going to look at are Add and Subtract. There are other settings here and they're useful for different things, but for the remainder of this course we're only looking at these two settings. So right now the mask, in the form of that rectangle shape, it's adding the color of the red solid inside of that shape layer. If I say subtract, it's going to show the white background layer inside of the rectangle shape and the red solid everywhere else. So that's a pretty important distinction, and as we get into our project this week, our project number 2, it's going to be really quite important to decide whether your shape layer is going to add or subtract. Now just like when we were creating a shape layer and we could draw multiple shapes inside of the same layer, what if, let's say I come to my star tool here and I draw out a star shape into my red solid. We see only the outline of that shape, but we don't see the background underneath it. That star shape is labeled as Mask 2 here. Its setting right now says Add. Let me pull this menu down, say Subtract. So now the star shape is serving as a mask that is subtracting that shape out of the red solid. To make this easier for me to keep track of, I'm going to start naming my mask layers. So my mask number 1 was the rectangle, mask number 2 was the star shape. So these masks are following a lot of the same rules as shapes do, which means that I could also come up here to my pen tool and begin to draw a freeform shape. Let me just add some random abstract shape down here, and I do need to close the shape off. So now it is one complete shape here. It's labeled as a mask, and right now its setting is to add. And it is adding that shape. If I come down here to subtract, now it's cutting out that shape, so we no longer see the red solid. I will call this one free shape. So we can be creating these masks just like we were creating shapes, which is why it was so important for us to get all of that practice time creating and moving shapes around. Let me grab my select tool here, and just like with the shape layers, any mask layer here that I highlight, I can now move that mask layer around as well. I'm just using the arrow keys here to move this up and down. And whatever shape layer I'm highlighting, I can move it around now. I could still come into this mask layer and make adjustments to it just like I can to a shape layer. For instance, let's say that I want this star shape to be a little bit larger. Let me start by highlighting that mask, and I double click around the star and I see this bounding box. So just like a shape, I can distort it. I could stretch it out in that direction. If I want to scale it but keep the same proportions, I can hold the Shift key down and pull one of the corners, and now it's getting larger and smaller. And just like with shape layers, I also see a rotate option here, so I could spin it around as I need to. So that's the basics of using shapes as mask layers. So try this out in an After Effects composition of your own. Creating a new solid layer is going to be a really quick way to start understanding the way that masks work, and practice using these modes of add and subtract just to see what happens as you do that.